There's a particular kind of silence that doesn't belong to the land. Most folks out here, they'll tell you silence is just silence, wind dropping, cattle settling, the world going quiet before dawn. But that's not what I mean. What I mean is the kind of silence that presses back. The kind that makes your horse stop without you pulling the rein. That makes the hair on your forearms rise even through a flannel shirt. That makes you look at a building. A simple, weathered, half-swallowed by scrub cabin sitting in a meadow nobody visits, and feel bone deep that whatever is in there has been waiting. Not waiting to be found. Waiting for the right person to find it. Emmett Greer was 43 years old, had ridden this stretch of the Sangre de Cristo foothills for 22 years, had passed that cabin at least 100 times, and had never once stopped. He told me later, sitting in my wagon while the village of Canyoncito gathered around us in the cold, that he couldn't explain why he stopped that morning. His horse stopped. He let it. Something in him said, today. What he found inside that cabin rewrote things, not just for him, for all of us. I'm going to tell you what really happened, not the version that gets told over fires, not the legend that's already growing in the retelling. The real version. The one with mud on its boots and grief in its throat and more questions than answers at the end. Because that's the only version that's true. Always have. Started when I was 19 and driving supply wagons between Santa Fe and Taos, and I needed somewhere to put all the things I was seeing that I had no one to tell. My mother had died. My father had no patience for what he called feeling things out loud, so I wrote them down instead, small observations, mostly. The way frost forms on a wagon wheel spoke different than it forms on the rim. The specific orange of a fire when you've burned juniper versus pinon. The way a man's hands move when he's lying versus when he's afraid. My name is Cass Foley. I am 31 years old. I run supply routes between 4 villages in the northern New Mexico territory. And I have a habit. My employer Roderick Vance calls it irritating. My one good friend Emmett Greer calls it witchcraft, of noticing things. I write them in a brown leather journal that I keep buttoned inside my coat. I have filled 11 of them. The 12th is the one I'm writing in now, sitting in the Canyoncito trading post with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, trying to get down everything that happened before the details soften and the emotion starts smoothing over the rough edges. Here's what I know for certain. It began with Emmett Greer, and a cabin nobody remembered was there. I'd ridden out to find him. That wasn't unusual. Emmett had a habit of disappearing, not in a concerning way, more in the way that some men disappear into the land because the land is where they think most clearly. He was a cowboy in the old-fashioned sense. Single, owned a small spread of about 40 acres northeast of Canyoncito, ran 30 head of cattle, and had approximately 1 conversation per week with another human being. He was fine with that. He was, I think, genuinely one of the few people I've ever met who was not lonely in his aloneness. He'd had a wife once. She died in childbirth 11 years ago along with the baby. After that, he'd contracted further into himself, like a plant in drought, and the 40 acres had become his whole world. I was bringing him a supply order, coffee, salt, a new pair of work gloves he'd requested, and a letter from his sister in Colorado that had been sitting at the trading post for 3 weeks. I rode out early, before the October morning had fully committed to warmth, the trail rising through scrub oak and pinon, and then opening into the high meadow grass that stretched toward the Sangre de Cristos in a wide, golden carpet. I found his horse first. Copper, a 17-year-old sorrel gelding who was almost insultingly calm in most situations, was standing still in the meadow, not grazing, not moving, just standing and looking toward the tree line at the western edge of the meadow. His ears were forward. His tail was motionless. I pulled up, looked around. No Emmett. Then I looked where Copper was looking, and I saw it. I don't know how I'd never noticed it before. I'd ridden through this meadow probably 30 times in 4 years. The answer, I think, is that the scrub oak had swallowed it almost completely. You could see it only if you were stopped and looking, which nobody did, because there was nothing in this meadow that should require stopping and looking. It was a cabin. Small. Maybe 16 feet by 20. Built from what looked like a mix of hand-hewn timber and adobe, the old territorial style, the kind of construction that meant it had been standing for a long time. The roof had partially collapsed on the east side. One window was intact, the other was open to the weather. And the door was open. Not broken open, not fallen. Open the way a door is opened when someone wants to go inside. I tied my horse beside Copper and walked toward it. The grass was wet from last night's dew and soaked through my boots almost immediately. There was no obvious trail to the cabin, just faint impressions in the ground that suggested maybe, once, people had walked here regularly. The scrub oak pressed close on all sides, and walking through the gap in it felt like stepping through a threshold I couldn't name. I stopped at the doorway. Inside there was Emmett Greer, and I knew from the way he was standing that something was wrong. Not wrong like hurt or danger. Wrong like a man who has just had the floor of his understanding drop out from under him. He was standing in the center of the single room, hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim in that nervous motion he has when he doesn't know what to do with his body. His back was to me. His head was slightly bowed, the way some men bow it in church. "Emmett," I said. He turned around. His face, I want to get this right because I've been trying to reconstruct it for 3 days, and I know I'll need this detail later. His face was not frightened. It was not joyful. It was the specific expression of a man encountering something he does not have a category for, jaw slightly loose, eyes wide and still, a muscle jumping once in his left cheek. Like every sorting mechanism he owned had momentarily stopped working. "Cass," he said, his voice was dust dry, "come in here." I went in. The room smelled of old wood and something else, something underneath the mold and the cold and the dry rot. Something I couldn't name immediately and then could. Lavender. Dried lavender, the faint ghost of it, as though someone had hung bundles of it from the rafters once and the scent had been trapped in the walls. My eyes adjusted. The cabin had been lived in. That much was immediately clear, not recently but fully, in the way that speaks to years of habitation rather than occasional use. There was a cast-iron stove against the north wall, its pipe going up through a hole in the ceiling that had been carefully sealed with clay. A rough-hewn table. 2 chairs, one of them broken, its legs snapped and leaning against the wall as if it had been set aside to be repaired, and never was. A shelf holding tin cups, a rusted coffee pot, 3 glass bottles stopped with wax. None of that was what Emmett was looking at. What he was looking at was the east wall. The east wall, partially roofed, the collapsed section was above it, but the overhang of what remained kept it mostly dry, was covered in drawings. Not scratches, not crude shapes. Drawings, careful, deliberate, extraordinary drawings done in charcoal and in something reddish-brown that I realized, with a slow crawl of recognition, was ochre, iron oxide mixed with something. Done in a hand that was steady and practiced and deeply, unmistakably skilled. Faces, landscapes, figures on horseback. A woman holding a child, not a baby but a small child, maybe 3 or 4, drawn with such specificity that you could see the way the child's hand clutched at the woman's collar. A mountain range I recognized as the Sangre de Cristos in winter, every ridge and shadow exact. A man sitting by a fire, his face half turned away, one hand extended toward the flame with that instinctive reaching that everyone does and nobody ever draws. I stood very still. Emmett was still turning his hat. "How long," I said, meaning, "how long have you been standing here?" "Hour," he said, "maybe more." I walked closer to the wall. There were dates on some of the drawings, scratched into the mud plaster beside them in a hand that wrote in both English and in script I didn't recognize immediately and then did. Spanish, written small and carefully. The dates ranged, as best I could read them in the low light from the doorway, from 1841 to, I had to lean close, my nose nearly touching the wall, 1879. 38 years. Someone had been making this record for 38 years. "Emmett," I said, "did you know this was here?" "No," he said, a single word and it landed with weight. "Nobody told you when you bought the property." "This isn't on my land," he said. "I checked the corner markers once. This meadow's on the other side of the survey line." "This is," he paused, working through it, "I think this is on old Benavides' land, the family that left before I came." I turned slowly in the room, taking it in, not just the drawings, the whole room, the care of it. The tin cups placed neatly. The broken chair set aside with intention. The stove pipe sealed properly. Someone had made this a home, not a shelter. "There's more," Emmett said. He pointed to the corner behind the stove. I hadn't noticed it because the light didn't reach there, and because my attention had been entirely absorbed by the drawings. I moved around the stove, feeling the radiated cold of it, metal that had not held heat in what felt like a very long time. In the corner, wrapped in what had once been a canvas tarpaulin, and was now mostly a stiffened shell of dried canvas that crumbled at the edges when I touched it, was a bundle. Not a small bundle. A stack of journals. I counted them. 15. 15 journals, varying sizes, some thin and some thick, bound with cord that had dried and tightened over time. The covers were different materials, some leather, some what looked like canvas itself, one that appeared to be made from the inside-out skin of something. They were stacked with the careful intentionality of something someone considered worth preserving. I looked at Emmett. He looked at me. "I haven't opened them," he said. "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, careful, like he was stepping around something fragile. "Because some things, once you open them, you can't close them back up." I understood that. I did. But I also, and this is where my particular affliction of noticing things becomes a burden, I could see the corner of the first journal's cover, and there was a drawing on it. Just a small one. A bird. An eagle or a hawk, drawn in a few economical strokes that conveyed not just the shape but the feeling of the thing, the weight of it on the air, the stillness before the stoop. "Emmett," I said, "someone drew that bird." "I know." "Whoever drew that bird," I stopped, tried again. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It's not." We stood there in that cold, lavender ghost cabin for another long moment while outside the meadow sat in its golden October stillness, and our horses waited. Then Emmett set his hat on the table, reached into the corner, and lifted the first journal. We didn't read them there. The light was wrong, too dim, and the writing, from what we could see of it, required careful attention. And something about reading them there, alone in that cabin with the cold and the silence pressing in, felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I needed, and I think Emmett needed, though he'd never say it that way, we needed to not be alone with what we were about to learn. Emmett carried the journals. I went back for the horses. We rode to Canyoncito. Now here is where I have to tell you about Canyoncito, because otherwise none of what comes next will land the way it should. Canyoncito still is, though it's changed, a small village of maybe 60 families in a narrow canyon along a creek that ran year-round and cold. It was a mix of people the way all small New Mexico villages were in those years. Hispanic families who'd been there for generations, some of them descended from Spanish land grant holders, some from Pueblo people who'd married into those lines. A handful of Anglo settlers who'd come in the last decade and stayed. A trading post run by an old man named Fulgencio Archuleta, who was 72 years old, had one good eye, and seemed to know everything that had ever happened in the territory within a 20-mile radius. There were also, living at the canyon's upper end in a cluster of 3 houses, 3 Apache families. Or rather, 2 full Apache families and 1 mixed family, the Whitehorse Delgado household, which was Marta Whitehorse, who was Apache through her mother's line, married to a man named Rogelio Delgado, who was from an old Hispano ranching family. They had 4 children. Their eldest, a daughter named Sola, was 20 and had, as near as I could tell, absorbed every language and cultural current that flowed through that canyon and made it all her own. I'm telling you about Sola now, because Sola becomes important later. But first, we rode into Canyoncito with 15 journals in a canvas sack strapped to Emmett's saddle, and we went directly to Fulgencio Archuleta's trading post. Fulgencio looked at the journals for a long time before he touched them. He turned them in his hands one by one, examining the covers, the binding cord, the way the pages sat. He did not speak. Emmett and I stood at the counter and waited. Fulgencio was the kind of man you did not rush. "Where?" he said finally. "Old meadow north of my spread," Emmett said. "There's a cabin out there." Fulgencio looked up. "The Chacon cabin." Emmett and I both stared at him. "You know it," I said. "I know of it," Fulgencio said carefully. "There are things I know about this canyon that nobody has asked me about in 30 years, and so I have stopped saying them." He set down the journal he was holding. "The Chacon family. They were here before me, before most families. The father, Hector Chacon, came in the 1830s from Chihuahua. He built in that meadow because the scrub oak gave shelter and the creek ran close." He paused. "His wife was Apache." The word sat in the room. "Mescalero," Fulgencio continued. "Her name, the name she used here, was Rosario. Her Apache name I never heard spoken outside of the family." He tapped one of the journals. Hector Chacon could not read or write, but Rosario could. The priests at the mission school had taught her before she married. She taught herself more from books she traded for. He stopped again, looked at the journals. If these are hers. They go to 1879, I said. Some of them, the dates on the wall drawings. Fulgencio was quiet for a long moment. Rosario Chacon died in 1879, he said. I was not yet here when she died, but the old ones told me. Her husband had died in the 1860s. She stayed alone in that meadow cabin for another 20 years. He put his hand flat on the stack of journals, not pressing, just resting. She raised children. She raised grandchildren. She outlived most of them. He looked up at us. When she died, nobody went to get her things. The family that remained had scattered, some to the reservation, some south. Some, you know how it was in those years. I did know. Emmett did too. The years between the Civil War's end and 1880 had ground through the Apache people of the territory with a particular and brutal efficiency. So the cabin just stayed, Emmett said. The cabin stayed, Fulgencio said. And everything in it stayed. He lifted the first journal, the one with the eagle on the cover, and untied the binding cord with fingers that were careful and surprisingly steady for a man his age. He opened it. The first page. I want to write this exactly as I wrote it in my log that evening, sitting in the corner of the trading post, while the light faded and Fulgencio read aloud, and Emmett sat across from me with his hat on his knee. The handwriting is small and deliberate, slanted slightly to the left, the way left-handed writers write when they've been trained on a right-handed standard. The ink varies, some entries in a dark, even line, others fading where the ink ran thin or the pen ran dry. The first line reads, I have been told that writing things down makes them real. I am writing this to find out if the opposite is also true. If I write down the things that are leaving, will they stay? Fulgencio read it in Spanish first, then translated. His voice did not change register when he translated. He kept it even factual, and that restraint was, I think, more devastating than any performance could have been. Emmett's jaw tightened. I wrote it down. The journal, the first one, the thinnest one, was dated 1841 and contained what appeared to be Rosario Chacon's first attempts at regular writing. The early entries were short and practical, weather records, planting notes, observations about the creek level. But even in those first short entries there was something, a quality of attention that was not merely practical. A woman watching the world and finding it worth the trouble of recording. The scrub oak today has leaves the color of my mother's blanket, Fulgencio read. I did not expect to think of her blanket when I looked at a tree. I have been thinking of her blanket now for an hour. I am writing this down so that I can stop thinking about it. Emmett made a sound that was not quite a word. We were in the trading post for 4 hours. Fulgencio read. We listened. He read slowly, selecting. We couldn't get through 15 journals in an afternoon, so he was choosing, navigating by instinct or prior knowledge toward the passages that mattered most. What emerged over those 4 hours was not a story in the conventional sense. It was a life. Rosario Chacon's life, in fragments in daily notes, in occasional long-sustained entries where she seemed to have sat down with particular intention to make a reckoning. The births of her children, the death of her husband, a single entry, 3 sentences, and then 2 blank pages, as if she'd left space for grief to fill and grief had filled it differently than words. The slow departure of her children over the years. The arrival of new settlers who didn't know her or her family. The years of increasing aloneness. And threaded throughout, the drawings. Not the physical drawings on the cabin wall, she described making those in several entries, treating it as naturally as describing cooking or weather, but drawings in the journals themselves. Small, precise sketches in the margins and between entries. Animals, plants, human figures always in motion, never posed. A child running, a man sleeping. A woman with her back to the viewer looking at something outside the journal's frame. Rosario Chacon had been extraordinary. That was the simple, unavoidable fact that built across 4 hours of listening. Not heroic in any grand sense. Not doing extraordinary things. Extraordinary in the way an individual human being becomes extraordinary when you pay close enough attention to them. The quality of their noticing, the patience of their endurance, the specific and irreplaceable texture of their particular way of being in the world. And she had been alone for 20 years. Alone in a meadow cabin with her journals and her drawings and her lavender and her memories, and nobody had known. Or rather, nobody had gone to know. There was a distinction there, and I was chewing on it as the light failed outside. It was Emmett who said what needed to be said. He'd been quiet for most of the reading. Emmett is not a man who processes things in real time. He processes them later, in the privacy of his own thinking, and then delivers conclusions. When Fulgencio reached the end of his fourth journal selection and paused to rest his eye, Emmett said, "She had family here. You said the Apache families at the upper end." Fulgencio nodded. "Some of her grandchildren's children. Yes, Marta Whitehorse's mother was Rosario's granddaughter." The room went very still. "Marta Whitehorse," Emmett said, "Rogelio Delgado's wife." "Yes. And Marta doesn't know about?" He gestured at the journals. "Marta's mother died young," Fulgencio said, "and the family had scattered from the meadow before Marta was born. What she knows of her mother's mother's mother." He paused. "I do not know what she knows, but I do not believe she knows about the cabin. I do not believe she knows about any of this." Emmett stood up. He moved to the trading post window and looked out at the canyon, at the last of the October light going amber on the canyon walls, and he was quiet for a long moment. "Then we should tell her," he said. It was said simply, with no performance, the way Emmett said most things. I wrote it down. What I didn't write down because I didn't trust myself to capture it accurately was the look on his face when he said it. Not noble, not decisive in any dramatic sense, something quieter and harder. A man who had spent 11 years in a 40-acre world of deliberate aloneness, who had, I suspected, told himself enough times that solitude was sufficient, that connection was for people who hadn't lost what he'd lost, standing at a window, and deciding that this dead woman's story was not going to be left alone in a cabin again if he had anything to say about it. I've thought about that moment many times since. The journal with the eagle on the cover sat on Fulgencio's counter. Outside, the canyon darkened. In the upper end of the village, in a house I'd visited a handful of times for supply deliveries, Marta Whitehorse Delgado was doing whatever she did at this hour, cooking, I imagined, or sitting with her children, with no idea that her great-great-grandmother's voice had been sitting in a meadow a mile from her house for 47 years. "We'll go in the morning," Emmett said. He picked up the journal with the eagle on the cover and held it like you hold something you've borrowed and intend to return. I stayed at the trading post that night. Fulgencio let me sleep on the cot in the back room, which smelled of coffee and old leather, and the particular dusty warmth of rooms that have been lived in for a long time. I wrote in my journal for an hour before the candle burned too low. I wrote about Rosario Chacon. I wrote about what it means to leave a record, whether you know you're leaving it, whether the record changes in nature, in weight, in meaning, depending on whether it's ever read. She wrote, "I am writing this to find out if the opposite is also true." She was asking whether writing things down could slow the leaving. She kept writing for 38 more years. Make of that what you will. I wrote about Emmett standing at the window. Then I closed the journal and lay in the dark and thought about the meadow, the pressed silence of it, the way Copper had stood without moving, ears forward. Some part of me, which is not the part that keeps logs and notes sensory details, thought, he stopped because it was time. I'm not sure I believe in things like that. But I'm not sure I don't. October in the Sangre de Cristo foothills does not arrive gently. It arrives with intent, with a sky the exact blue of something that has given up pretending to be anything other than what it is, and with air that goes into your lungs like cold water. I was awake before light. I'd slept in snatches, which is what I do when my mind is moving fast, and by the time gray was showing at the edge of the canvas I'd tacked over the back room's window, I was already dressed and writing. Emmett came to the trading post at first light. He knocked twice, which is how Emmett announces himself, 2 knocks, no more, no less, and then he waits. I let him in. Fulgencio was already up, already had coffee on a small iron stove in the corner that I'd somehow missed the night before. Old men and insomnia, a universal arrangement. "Did you sleep?" I asked Emmett. "Some," he said, which meant no. We drank coffee standing up. Fulgencio gave us bread, the flat kind, pan-cooked, and didn't try to make conversation, which I appreciated. The journals were still on the counter where we'd left them, stacked carefully, the Eagle journal on top. "I've been thinking," Emmett said when the coffee was half gone. "About how to tell her," I said. About whether to bring the journals, he said. I thought about that. They're hers, I said. They belong to her family. They belong to Rosario's family, Emmett said. Marta is Rosario's family. But he paused, turning the cup in his hands. Showing up at a woman's house before breakfast with 15 journals, and saying your ancestor that nobody told you about left these in a cabin in the meadow. That's a particular kind of morning to walk into. You want to go talk to her first, I said. I want to understand what she knows first, he said, before we add to it or change it. Fulgencio from the corner said, take Sola. We both looked at him. Sola Delgado, he said. She speaks Apache, she speaks Spanish and English. Her grandmother was Rosario's granddaughter. She is the one to take. He looked at Emmett steadily. She is also the one who will keep her mother calm when the shock comes. You know it'll be a shock, Emmett said. Finding that your great-great-grandmother kept a 38-year diary of her life, alone in a meadow a mile from where you've lived your whole life. Fulgencio made a small, dry sound that might have been a laugh. Yes, I think it will be a shock. We found Sola Delgado down at the creek. It was early enough that the frost was still white on the grass at the creek's edges, and she was there with a bucket, filling it, and she looked up when she heard us coming without any of the wariness that some people have when strangers approach them at a creek before sunrise. She just looked up, assessed, and waited. I'd spoken to Sola a handful of times on supply runs. She was, and I want to be careful here, because easy descriptions do her a disservice. She was a person of striking practical intelligence. Not striking in a way that announced itself, but in the way that becomes apparent when she's in a conversation. She gathered information, she held it, and she responded to what was actually being said rather than to what was expected to be said. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's cheekbones, and a way of standing that was entirely her own, weight back slightly, arms loose, as if she was always ready to either work or walk and was comfortable with either option. She was also, I'd noticed, a person who didn't fill silences with noise. That was going to matter today. Emmett explained, briefly, in the spare way he had, what we'd found. The cabin, the journals, what Fulgencio had told us about Rosario Chacon. Sola listened without expression. When he was done, she was quiet for what felt like 30 seconds, but was probably 10. My mother has mentioned her, she said. Rosario, I said. She called her Shana Bainali Bitsi, Sola said. Her grandmother's grandmother. She said she was a woman who... She paused, and her expression shifted in a way I couldn't quite name. She said she was a woman who wrote things down, that she always had paper, that it was a thing people remembered about her. The cold air between us. She didn't know about the cabin, Emmett asked. She knew Rosario had lived somewhere in the meadow, but Sola stopped. No, she didn't know there was a cabin still standing. She thought everything was gone. She looked at Emmett directly. Are the journals readable? Most of them, I said. Fulgencio has been. My mother reads Spanish, Sola said, and some English. If Fulgencio reads, she won't have to wait for someone to translate. She picked up her bucket, which was now full. Give me an hour with her, then come. She walked back toward the village without looking back. Emmett and I stood at the creek. She knew, he said. She knew something, I said. That her ancestor wrote things down, he said. She carried that forward, she knew that much. The White Horse Delgado house was at the upper end of the canyon, where the creek bent and the canyon walls narrowed and the piñon grew thick on both sides. It was a good-sized adobe, added onto over the years. You could see the different construction phases in the way the roof lines didn't quite match, the way the plaster was newer on the north addition. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall, mostly put to bed for winter, with the dry stalks of summer beans still tied to their poles and moving slightly in the morning wind. We knocked at an hour past sunrise, Sola answered. She stepped outside rather than inviting us in immediately, pulling the door mostly closed behind her, and spoke quietly. I told her, she said. I told her what you found. A brief pause, the first hesitation I'd seen from her. She's all right. She wants to see them, but she asked me to ask you, are there drawings? Yes, Emmett said. On the cabin walls. Sola absorbed that. She said Rosario was a drawer, that it was the other thing people remembered. She looked at Emmett steadily. She said her own mother used to draw in the margins of things, receipts, letters. She didn't know where the habit came from. She's been sitting in there since I told her, and I could see her understanding that she knows where it came from. There was a weight to that. The passing down of a habit across 4 generations, the root of it buried in a meadow cabin that nobody visited, and now the root suddenly visible. Sola opened the door. Marta Whitehorse Delgado was 51 years old and had the look of a woman who had worked hard her entire life and was not complaining about it. She was seated at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, which I recognized as the posture of someone who is making a deliberate choice to appear composed. Her husband Rogelio was standing in the doorway to the next room. He'd been there when we came in, and he stayed there throughout, not intrusive, not absent, just present in the way that good husbands are present when something is happening to their wife that they cannot fix but can witness. The 4 children, I knew there were 4, though I'd only interacted with Sola, were not visible. Somewhere in the house, I thought. Marta looked at the journals when Emmett set them on the table. She didn't touch them immediately. She looked at them the way you look at something you've been told about but never expected to see, not with surprise exactly, because Sola had prepared her, but with that particular quality of recognition that isn't about information. It's about the body already knowing something the mind is just catching up to. "Shitye," she said quietly. My grandmother, the formal, distant kind, the one several generations back. She said it like a confirmation rather than an exclamation. Fulgencio had come with us, walking slowly with his cane, and he settled himself at the table across from Marta with the gravity of a man who had been involved in the story longer than anyone else in the room. He set the Eagle Journal on the table between them. "I will read to you," he said in Spanish. "And Sola will help with anything difficult. You tell me when to stop." Marta nodded. Fulgencio opened the journal. "I'm going to try to describe what the next 2 hours were like, and I know I'm going to fall short of it." Fulgencio read. He read the opening line, "I have been told that writing things down makes them real," and Marta closed her eyes briefly and opened them again. He read through the early practical entries, the weather records and planting notes, and Marta listened with a stillness that was not absence but attention, the kind of listening that gathers everything. He read, "Hector says I spend too long looking at things. I told him that looking is how I learn them. He said he learns by doing." I said, "Then what you learn cannot be written down." He didn't answer, which is how Hector agrees. Rogelio made a small sound from the doorway, almost a laugh. He read the entry about the lavender. "I planted lavender because my mother planted lavender. I planted it for the smell, which is the smell of her hands. When I crush the flowers and hold them, she is here. I understand now that smell is the memory that does not diminish. Sight goes, sound goes, but smell." Marta put her hand over her mouth. Fulgencio kept reading. He was very good at this. I wrote in my journal later that he read the way a decent person witnesses grief. Steadily, without flinching, without rushing toward resolution. He read about the children. "Diego walked to the East Meadow and back today. He is 3 years old. He walked the whole way without complaint. He is stubborn in the most complete way, not the kind that breaks things, but the kind that simply goes until it arrives. I don't know where he gets this from. Hector says he gets it from me. I am flattered." He read about Hector's death. That entry, 3 sentences, as I'd noted, landed in the room like a stone landing in deep water. There was no splash, just the impact and then the depth. "Hector died this morning at dawn. He was in no pain at the end. I have put this down so that it is real." And then the 2 blank pages. Fulgencio turned them slowly, showing the blank space, and the room understood what those pages were. Marta was not crying. She was doing something harder than crying. She was holding the grief at a slight distance and examining it, turning it, trying to understand what she was feeling and why. Sola sat beside her mother. At some point in the reading, I noted the moment. Sola put her hand over her mother's hand on the table, and Marta turned her hand over and gripped it, and they sat that way for the rest of Fulgencio's reading. He read about the years after Hector, the building of routines, the drawings on the cabin wall. I put Hector's face on the wall today from memory. I made him look the way he looked when he was young before the years, when he was first telling me about his plan to go north, to the Sangre de Cristos, as if the mountains were a gift he was presenting me. I made him look like that. I don't know if I got it right. Memory is imprecise. I put it there anyway. He read about the children leaving not all at once but one by one over years. Lucinda has gone south with her husband's family. She said she will write. I believe she will try. The territory is difficult for letters. And then, months later, a letter from Lucinda. She has a girl. She says the girl has my eyes. I am glad and I am not glad. Eyes are not enough. He read the late journals, the 1870s entries with particular care, and the texture of the writing had changed by then. Rosario Chacon at 60 and older wrote in longer sentences, more reflective, less practical. The record-keeping impulse had given way to something more like reckoning. There are new people in the canyon now. They come and ask Fulgencio for things, and they do not know me. I am not unkind about this. I was new once. But I have been here now for, I count it, 32 years. 32 years, and I have watched this canyon go from a place that knew my name to a place that does not. I am thinking about what remains when you are no longer there to insist on your own presence. I am thinking that what remains is what you leave. I am going to be more careful about what I leave. That entry was from 1873. After 1873, the journals changed again. The entries became more deliberate, more crafted, as if Rosario was writing with the knowledge that she was writing for someone, even if she didn't know who. Details she'd previously mentioned briefly became fully rendered. Stories from before the cabin, from her childhood, from her life before Hector, from her mother and grandmother, appeared, written with the patient completeness of someone assembling a gift. My grandmother told me, the things you carry from the people before you are not burdens. They are proof that those people existed. When you carry them, those people are not finished yet. I am writing this down for whoever comes after me. You are not finished yet either. Neither am I. Fulgencio read that sentence and stopped. The room held it. Marta put her forehead down on the table, just for a moment, just briefly, and when she raised it again, her eyes were bright, but her face was steady. She knew, Marta said. She knew someone would come. She asked to go to the cabin. Not immediately. She needed an hour, she said, to compose herself, and she wanted to bring the children. Rogelio went to gather them from wherever they were in the house, and I stepped outside to give the family the room while Fulgencio rested in the chair. I stood outside the White Horse Delgado house and wrote in my journal for 30 minutes. I wrote about what the reading had done to the room, how Fulgencio's voice had filled the kitchen not just with Rosario Chacon's words, but with the specific weight of 47 years of absence, of a story that had been sitting in a meadow unclaimed, of all the things Marta had not known about herself that she now knew. I wrote, there is an inheritance that is not land or money or possessions. It is the inheritance of someone's attention, of the record they kept, of the specific things they chose to notice and write down. Rosario Chacon left her family 47 years of her attention, and they didn't know they had it. Emmett came and stood beside me. He didn't say anything for a while, just looked at the canyon walls in the morning light. Do you think, he started. Yes, I said, without knowing what the question was. He made a sound that might have been agreement. We rode to the meadow at mid-morning. All of us, Marta and Rogelio, their 4 children, Sola, and 3 younger ranging from 11 to 16, Fulgencio in a wagon because he couldn't ride any more, Emmett and me. Half the village seemed to become aware that something was happening and trailed along, as villages do. Because in a village of 60 families, the movement of 7 people toward the same place at the same time is noticed and followed by curiosity. And by the time we reached the meadow's edge, there were perhaps 20 people, then 30. The cabin sat in the morning light, changed from how I'd seen it yesterday. I mean this literally. The angle of the sun was different, and it came through a gap in the scrub oak and caught the east wall of the cabin at a low angle that illuminated the adobe plaster in a warm gold. The partial roof collapse I'd noted was on the other side. From this angle, the cabin looked almost intact. Marta stopped at the tree line. She stood at the edge of the scrub oak and looked across the meadow at the cabin for a long moment. The frost had melted from the grass now, and the meadow was bright in the morning, the golden grasses moving slightly. The cabin was still. Sola stood beside her. The 3 younger children had drifted slightly behind, not reluctant exactly, but children have an instinct for adult moments that require a certain distance, and they kept it. It's small, Marta said. She was 1 person, Sola said. 2, Marta said. She and my grandfather built it, then 1. She walked forward. We all went in. The cabin was not large enough for 30 people, But they came in shifts, some standing at the doorway, some outside looking through the window, rotating so that everyone who wanted to see the wall could see it. The drawings, in the full morning light that came through the door and the intact window, were clearer than yesterday. More of them, too. I'd been looking at the area Emmett had been looking at. But the drawings extended across almost the entire wall, and along the south wall as well, and even on sections of the ceiling plaster that had survived. Marta stood at the east wall for a very long time. She put her hand up, not quite touching, hovering an inch away over the drawing of the woman holding the child. The one I'd noticed yesterday, with the child's hand gripping the collar. "That's her," Marta said. "The woman, that's Rosario." She was certain of it, there was no question in her voice. "How do you know?" Sola asked. "Because I know that posture," Marta said. "My mother stood like that, I stand like that." She turned her head slightly to look at Sola. "You stand like that." Sola looked at her own hands. From outside, I heard one of the villagers, I didn't see who, say something in Spanish that Fulgencio later translated for me. He said, "She was here the whole time, just here." Waiting. Marta crouched slowly and looked at the lower section of the east wall where the drawings were smaller and more densely packed. Studies. I thought. The kind of thing an artist makes when they're practicing, when they're working out how to render something. There were birds. A dozen birds drawn in a few strokes each, all of them different hawks, jays, a hummingbird that was tiny and somehow exactly right, a raven with its beak open. They were labeled in Rosario's careful handwriting with names in 2 languages, the Spanish common name, and beside it in different script, names in what I recognized as Apache. "She kept both," Marta said softly. "Both," Emmett said. "Both names for every bird." Marta touched one, the raven label. "This is the Apache name." She didn't forget it. She'd been married to a Spanish man in a Spanish canyon for 30 years. She could have let it go, she kept it. She looked at Sola. Chiche kept both. Sola's jaw was tight, she nodded. "I want to tell you about the moment that the village of Canyoncito understood what it was standing in. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way understanding usually happens, gradually, then suddenly, as more people cycled through the cabin and came out changed, as Fulgencio translated and explained, as the journals were carefully passed between hands. It was Rogelio Delgado who named it first, standing outside the cabin with his hand on the doorframe. "She built this village," he said. "Not a claim, not an argument, just a recognition. She and Hector came first. They built in this meadow. The others came after, and they came because there was already something here." Fulgencio in the wagon said, "That's true." "And none of us," Rogelio stopped, looked at his hands. "None of us knew," Fulgencio said. "That's also true." "My family," Rogelio said. "My family has been in this canyon for 3 generations. We came after the Chacons. We didn't know them, they were before, but we built on what they built." He looked at the cabin. "And I've ridden past this meadow." He stopped again. "We all have," Emmett said. Rogelio looked at him, then at me, then back at the cabin. He said something in Spanish that I caught most of. "We forgot her. We forgot them. All this time she was in a meadow a mile from us, and we forgot." It was not an accusation. It was a reckoning. I wrote in my log that afternoon, sitting on the wagon tongue while around me the village processed what it was learning. They forgot, but the cabin didn't forget. The journals didn't forget. The drawings didn't forget. Rosario Chacon wrote things down for 38 years and left 15 journals in a canvas tarpaulin in a corner, not because she knew someone would find them, she couldn't have known, but because the writing was its own reason. And then, 47 years after her death, her great-great-granddaughter stood in front of her drawings and recognized her own posture in the woman her ancestor drew. This is what I think about continuity now. It is not guaranteed. It requires tending. And when it breaks, the break is real and the loss is real. But sometimes, not always, not reliably, but sometimes, what's lost finds its way back. I closed the journal. Around me, the village moved through the meadow. Marta sat on the cabin's threshold with 3 of the journals open across her knees, reading slowly, the morning light on her face. Sola had brought one of the younger children, the 11-year-old, a boy named Elias, inside, and was showing him the bird drawings, reading him the names in both languages. Emmett sat against the scrub oak 15 feet from the cabin door, watching. I walked over and sat next to him. "Are you all right?" I asked. He thought about that with more seriousness than the question might have seemed to warrant. I keep thinking about what she said, he said. Rosario, that thing she wrote, neither am I about not being finished. I know, I said. He stopped. I've been very finished, he said, in my own head for a long time. I let that sit. After a while, he said, a woman spent 20 years alone in this cabin after everything she lost, and she kept writing, kept drawing, kept both languages for the birds, kept... He stopped again, pressed his jaw tight for a moment. That's something. Yeah, I said. He was quiet for another long moment. I'm going to fix the roof, he said. I looked at him. The east side, he said. The collapsed section, it'll let the water in, the drawings will go. That'll take some doing, I said. I know, he said. I'll start next week. He stood up, put his hat on, and walked toward the cabin. 3 weeks after we found the cabin, the first snow came to Canyoncito. Not the light, tentative snow that sometimes visits in October. The real snow, heavy and committed. The kind that arrives in the night and by morning has filled the canyon to a new geometry, every surface smoothed and re-angled and made unfamiliar. I woke to it in the trading post back room, where I'd been staying for reasons I hadn't fully admitted to myself, and lay for several minutes listening to the particular silence that snow imposes, which is different from all other silences. I wrote, snow silence has a texture. It's not the absence of sound, but the presence of absorption. The world has grown ears. Emmett was already at the cabin. I'd known he would be. I dressed and rode out through snow that came to Copper's knees in the drifts, following the trail Emmett had cleared and recut over the last 3 weeks until it was as defined as the original track had once been. The scrub oak held snow on its branches in the way scrub oak does, improbably, in quantities that seemed too large for the branches, and then released it in cascades when the wind moved. The meadow was white. The cabin had a new roof. Half of it anyway. The east section, the collapsed portion, the one above the drawings, had been repaired. Emmett had worked at it 6 days out of the last 21, sometimes with Rogelio Delgado or his eldest son, sometimes alone. He'd sourced timber from his own wood lot. He'd resealed the stovepipe hole with new clay. He'd rehung the door, which had been sitting open on a broken hinge since before we'd found it, so that it closed again properly. The west half of the roof was still the original, aged, precarious, but holding. Emmett had left it because it was holding. He'd said, I'll fix what needs fixing, I won't improve what doesn't. I tied my horse and went in. The first thing I noticed was the warmth. Not much warmth, a low, banked warmth. The stove was going. A small fire, just enough to keep the temperature above freezing, which was what the drawings needed. Emmett sat at the table he'd cleaned and stabilized, the broken chair replaced with a stool he'd made from a split log, with the 5th of Rosario's journals open in front of him. His coffee cup was beside it. He looked up when I came in. Snow, I said. I know, he said. I was here when it started. He'd been here through the night then. I didn't say anything about that. Which one? I said, meaning the journal. The 5th, he said. Fulgencio lent it to me. He's been rotating them. Marta takes a few, reads, returns them, takes more. Fulgencio gives me one at a time. He looked down at the page. This is from 1859. She's writing about learning to make adobe in a different way. There was a dry year and the clay mixture she'd always used wasn't holding right, so she started asking people in the canyon what they did, and she writes about each conversation. He turned the page. She asked a Pueblo man who came through trading. She asked an old Spanish woman whose family had built in the territory for 100 years. She asked a traveler from Chihuahua. She put their methods all down and then mixed them until she found what worked. She was a learner, I said. She was a collector, he said, of useful things from anyone who had them. He closed the journal carefully. She didn't care where the knowledge came from, just whether it worked. The cabin had become something by those 3 weeks that I hadn't anticipated. Not a monument, not a museum. Something closer to what it had always been, a place where people came. Canyoncito was a small village, and small villages operate on the social logic of gathering. You find reasons to be in the same place, and then things happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. The cabin, since the finding, had become a gathering point. It started with Marta. She came every few days, sometimes with Sola, sometimes alone, sometimes with one of the younger children. She sat with the journals. She sat with the drawings. Sometimes she brought her own paper and her own charcoal and drew, not copies of Rosario's drawings but her own, in a style I'd seen her use before, which I now understood was the family style. The same economy of stroke, the same instinct for motion over stillness, the same attention to the specific texture of individual things rather than their general shapes. She and Emmett had reached an arrangement that nobody had formally articulated but that everyone understood. The cabin was Rosario's, by which they meant it was the family's, which meant it was Marta's, and Emmett was the steward of it. He maintained it. Marta used it. The village honored both. Others came too. Fulgencio came, twice, carried in the wagon and helped inside by Rogelio, and sat with specific journals that he'd identified as containing references to events he had some knowledge of, the 1860s, the years he'd arrived in the territory, the crossovers between Rosario's recorded world and his own memory. He and Marta had long conversations that Sola sometimes translated for me in fragments. The Apache families from the upper end came, and that was something, because there were generations of quiet separateness in the canyon, not hostile but parallel, the way communities sometimes are when they share a space but have been through enough pain that parallel is the safest arrangement. Rosario Chacon, dead since 1879, turned out to be a bridge. Because she had been both things, Apache by birth, by tongue, by memory, and had also made a life in the canyon with all its mixed and complicated humanity, and had written it all down in 2 languages. She kept both. Marta had said that. It had become, in the canyon, a shorthand. You'd hear it used when someone was navigating between the community's different currents, between the expectations of different families or traditions. She kept both. It meant you don't have to choose. It meant the records can hold more than one thing. I'm going to tell you about the 3rd week. Specifically, I'm going to tell you about the afternoon Sola came to the cabin alone, and I happened to be there making notes while Emmett worked on the west wall's exterior chinking. She came in without knocking. Nobody knocked at the cabin now. It wasn't that kind of space. And she sat in the stool Emmett had made and put her hands flat on the table the way her mother did when she was composing herself. I looked up, wrote one more word, capped my pen. Something's happened, I said. My mother, she said. She's been reading the late journals. I know, I said. Fulgencio said she's on the 13th. There's an entry, Sola said. From 1877, Rosario writes about a visit. She paused. From a family, an Apache family that came through the canyon in 1877. She names them. Another pause. One of the names she gives is my mother's grandfather's name. I set down my pen. He passed through, I said. He stayed, Sola said, for 3 months. In the winter of 1877. Rosario wrote about it, all of it, the whole 3 months in detail. He was sick when he arrived. She nursed him through it. He recovered. He stayed through the winter and left in the spring. She stopped. Her jaw was working slightly, the way someone's does when they're deciding how much to say. Sola, I said. My mother never knew what happened to him in that winter, she said. He came back to the family in the spring and he never talked about where he'd been or what had happened. It was, she said, her own mother told her it was a mystery. He came back different, they said, quieter, but well, healed. She looked at the east wall at the drawings. She didn't know who had healed him. The fire in the stove made a small sound, a settling of wood. She's reading it, I said. She's reading it now, Sola said. Back at the house, Fulgencio is with her. She looked at her own hands. She sent me here. She said she couldn't read it and be at the cabin at the same time. It was too much. She needed me to be here while she read. I understood that. Some things require a witness in a different location, as if the intensity of a discovery needs to be distributed across space. I'm here, I said. Sola nodded. She looked at the wall. She drew him, Sola said. Rosario drew him. There's a drawing in the journal, not on the wall, in the journal itself. A man sitting by a fire. My mother recognized him. Her voice was very steady. From a photograph she has. From photographs? The man sitting by a fire with one hand extended toward the flame. I looked at the east wall. The drawing I'd noticed on the very first day. Emmett came in from outside, stamping snow from his boots, and he read the room immediately, that particular skill he had, assessing emotional temperature without being told. He stopped, looked at me, looked at Sola. Sit down, I said. We should wait. For what? He said. For Marta, I said. Sola thinks she'll come. He poured himself coffee from the pot that now always sat on the stove when anyone was in the cabin. He didn't ask any more questions. The three of us sat in the warm cabin while the snow fell outside, and the meadow went white and quiet. Marta came an hour later. She came alone, no Rogelio, no Fulgencio, no younger children. She came through the snow in her heavy coat, and she had the 13th journal in her hands, pressed against her chest with both arms, the way you carry something you are not going to put down. She came through the door and she stood for a moment, and then she went directly to the east wall, to the lower section, to the man sitting by a fire. She put her hand on it, actually on it, the way she hadn't touched the other drawing, the woman and child. She pressed her palm flat against the plaster and the drawing of her great-great-grandmother's great-grandfather. She knew him, Marta said. She wrote about him for 3 months and I have it all, everything, what he ate when he was sick, what he said when the fever broke, what he laughed at, what he sang. Her voice was even, almost analytical, but her hand was shaking slightly where it pressed the wall. She wrote, he sings at night when he thinks everyone is asleep. I don't tell him I can hear. Some songs are for the night, not for the morning. She was not crying. I don't think she was capable of crying right then. She was too fully occupied by what was happening. There was no surplus for tears. She knew him, she said again. She healed him, Sola said. She knew him, Marta said. And she left me the record of knowing him. She left me. She stopped, turned around, looked at all of us, at me, Sola. She left me everything. She left me his songs. She described his songs. I have never heard those songs. My mother never heard them. They were lost, but Rosario described them in enough detail that. She stopped. We waited. Enough detail, she said carefully, that I could ask someone who knows those songs if they recognize the description. There are people who might know. The understanding of what she was saying arrived slowly, and then completely. Songs thought lost, described in a journal in a meadow cabin by a woman who'd listened from her sleeping corner to a sick man sing to the night. Written down because she wrote everything down, because writing things down was what she did, because she'd asked once whether writing things down could slow the leaving. I have thought many times since about what Rosario Chacon understood, and what I think she understood is this, that the act of attention, deep, sustained, particular attention, the kind that goes into keeping a record over 38 years, is not passive. It is an act of love, though not the sentimental kind. It is the love that says, you are real and specific and irreplaceable, and I am going to prove it by making a record so careful that even after I am gone, even after you are gone, someone can find the record and know you were real. She kept both. She kept the names of birds in 2 languages. She kept the songs of a man who sang at night when he thought no one was listening. She kept 47 years of weather and planting and children and grief and lavender. And then she wrapped it in a tarpaulin and put it in a corner. Not for anyone, just to keep it. And it kept. The days after Marta found the songs were the days when the village changed. I don't know how else to describe it. Cañoncito had always been a village that functioned together in the practical sense. Shared water, shared labor during harvest and building, shared celebration at feast days. But it had its parallel lines, its quiet separations, the walls that communities build over generations of loss and tension and the careful management of difference. The cabin cracked some of those walls. Not all at once, not cleanly. Walls don't come down cleanly. They come down in sections, and the rubble stays, and you have to navigate the rubble for a long time before the ground clears. But Marta went to the Apache families at the upper end of the canyon with the description of the songs, and that conversation, which Sola translated and I was present for, notebook open on my knee, writing as fast as I could, lasted 3 hours. An old woman named Constantia, who was 81 and had lived in the territory her whole life, recognized the description of one of the songs. She didn't just recognize it, she knew it. She began to sing it, softly, in the way old women sing things they are deciding whether to give away, carefully, holding something back at first, and then letting it go. The song filled the small room. Marta sat very still. After she said, and Sola translated, that she had never heard that song in her life, and she had always felt an absence she couldn't name, the way you feel the absence of a word in your vocabulary that you didn't know you were missing until you learn it exists in another language. Constantia said that the song had been for healing, that it was sung over the sick. Marta closed her eyes. When she opened them, she said, "Rosario sang it with him." Sola looked at her. "How do you know?" "She wrote it," Marta said. "She wrote that she learned the song over 3 weeks, sitting with him, listening. She said she learned it badly at first, and he corrected her, and she learned it well at the end." She looked at Constantia. "She kept it, too." Emmett finished the west wall chinking in the 2nd week of November. By that point, the cabin had, without anyone formally deciding it, acquired something close to an ongoing life. There was always firewood inside, rotated by Roglio's boys. The stove was kept lit when anyone was there. The journals rotated through careful hands. Fulgencio had begun a project, with Sola's help, of creating handwritten copies of each journal, one original and one copy, so that the originals could be preserved with more care and the copies could be read without risking the worn pages. I had started at Marta's request, making my own notation, a careful transcription of all the drawings on the wall, rendered in ink with my own hand, as faithful as I could manage. I'm no artist. My copies were utilitarian, not beautiful, but they were accurate, and accurate was what was needed. If the wall failed, the old plaster was not going to last forever. The record would survive. Marta said, "You're doing what she did." I said, "I'm trying to." She looked at my notation book. "She would have approved of you," she said. She wrote about people who wrote things down. She said in one of the early journals that a person who notices things is either a spy or someone who loves the world. She said there was no other explanation. I didn't know what to do with that, so I wrote it down. There was a difficulty. I don't want to give the impression that what happened in Canyoncito in those November weeks was uncomplicated or purely beautiful. There were things that were hard. There were members of the older Spanish families in the canyon who felt, or who expressed feeling, a discomfort with the attention being paid to the cabin, not hostility toward Rosario or toward Marta's family, but something harder to name, a sense of disruption, a feeling that the existing order of the village's memory was being revised in ways they hadn't been consulted on. One man, I won't give his name, it's not my record to make, said to Fulgencio privately that he was concerned about what all of this was doing to the village's sense of itself. Fulgencio said in his unhurried way, "It's doing what it always does when you learn something you didn't know. It's requiring the adjustment." The man said he wasn't sure adjustment was always necessary. Fulgencio said, "It required adjustment for Marta too. It required adjustment for Emmett. It required adjustment for me, and I have known about the Chacon family for 40 years. He paused. "Adjustment is uncomfortable. The alternative is to pretend you don't know what you know." I wrote that down. There were also, and this was harder, members of the Apache families in the Upper Canyon who had feelings about the journals and the cabin that were more complicated than simply joy. Specifically, the discovery of Rosario's record made vivid what had been lost and by what mechanism. Rosario had survived and kept her record. Her children's children had scattered. The years between 1865 and 1880 had been brutal in ways that the journals recorded from the outside, from the meadow cabin's limited vantage, but that the Apache families who'd lived those years knew from the inside. A man named Delbert, who was 60 and whose grandfather had been at the Bosque Redondo, came to the cabin once and stood in the doorway for a long time without going in. Then he said quietly, "She was lucky to have a hiding place." I didn't write it, some things you don't write. But I've thought about it ever since. The last thing I have to tell you about is Emmett, and the decision he made in late November. By then, the snow was established in the canyon, and I was preparing to resume my supply routes. I'd stayed longer than I'd planned, far longer. The kind of longer that happens when you look up one day and realize you've stopped making plans to leave. Emmett came to the trading post on a Tuesday morning and sat across from me, and drank his coffee in the particular deliberate way that meant he had something to say, and was deciding how to say it. I waited. "The Whitehorse Delgado family," he said. "Marta." "Yes," I said. "I want to put the cabin on a proper survey," he said. "Have it registered in the family's name." I looked at him. "It's on old Benavides land. That's a complicated situation." "I know," he said. "I've already spoken to the Territorial Land Office. There's a process for derelict parcels when there's a rightful heir who can be identified. It's complicated and it takes time, but it's possible." "That's," I said. "It's their cabin," he said. It's always been their cabin. The fact that no one registered it doesn't change what it is. He said this without any performance, any seeking of credit. He said it the way he said most things, as a statement of fact that happened to also be a decision. "You'll need a land agent," I said. "I know a man in Santa Fe," he said. "I'll write to him this week." I looked at him for a long time. He looked back at me with the particular steadiness that was his baseline expression. "Emmett," I said, "can I ask you something?" "You always ask," he said. "Whether or not I give you permission." "Why this?" I said. "You've been alone is not quite the right word, but—" "Finished," he said. He used the word he'd used before. "I told you." "You told me you've been finished," I said, "in your own head for a long time." "Yes," he said. "And now you're going to spend the next year navigating territorial land law to register a derelict parcel for a family that has no legal standing to claim it," I said. "That's work," he said simply. "It's work that needs doing." "Emmett." "Cass," he said with a patience that was not unkind. "She wrote for 38 years in a cabin alone. She wrote, 'I am going to be more careful about what I leave.' She had lost almost everything. She still thought what she left was going to matter." He set down his cup. "I've been 43 years old for long enough. I'm going to try being something else." He stood up, put his hat on, and left. I rode out the next morning. Supply routes don't wait, even for stories that are still happening. And I had 3 villages waiting on coffee and salt and work gloves and letters from sisters in Colorado. I stopped at the cabin on my way. The fire was low. Emmett had been there earlier, I could tell, and the east wall glowed in the thin winter light, every drawing visible, every careful line Rosario Chacon had made in ochre and charcoal. The man by the fire, the mountains in winter, the woman holding the child, the birds with their 2 language names, a mountain range at dawn, a creek in summer, a whole world recorded. I stood there for a long time. Then I opened my journal to a clean page, and I drew, badly, unskillfully, but with intention, a quick sketch of the cabin as I was leaving it. The new roof over the east section, the stove pipe, the door closed on its repaired hinge, the scrub oak holding snow. I drew it and dated it and labeled it in small letters at the bottom. Canyoncito Meadow Cabin, November 1882, standing. I closed the journal, buttoned it inside my coat. Copper moved beneath me, ready. The meadow lay still and white around us, and above the canyon the sky was that deep committed blue of a New Mexico winter, and somewhere in the canyon behind me, the village of Canyoncito was going about its morning. Fulgencio's stove, Rogelio's boys with the firewood, Marta at her table with her charcoal and the journal she was currently copying in her own hand. Solar at the creek with a bucket, Emmett somewhere between his 40 acres and the land agent's letter, and all of it felt. In a way I couldn't fully account for, like something that was going to hold. Not forever. Nothing holds forever. The plaster would eventually fail. The journals would yellow. The people would scatter or age or be carried away by the ordinary disasters that carry everyone eventually. But for now it was holding. I turned Copper toward the trail. Behind me, I didn't look back, but I felt it. The cabin sat in its meadow in the way that things sit when they have been properly returned to themselves. Not waiting anymore, just there. She had written, "I am writing this to find out if the opposite is also true. If I write down the things that are leaving, will they stay?" 38 years later and 47 years after that, I think I know the answer. Not exactly stay, but close enough. Close enough that a woman who never met you can recognize your posture in her own shoulders. Close enough that songs you sang can be remembered by a stranger's careful listening. Close enough that a cowboy can stop in a meadow on an October morning because his horse stops. Because something in him says today. Because what is waiting in a cabin has been waiting for the right person, and that person turns.